All right. Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello.
Good to see some of you back this week. And good to see you, Les. Glad you can join us and
Thank you very much.
share with us this evening.
Good to be with you.
Abe has it set up so it's automatically recording so that it's dummy proof, because I was the dummy who was supposed to start the recording last week and forgot to until.
How'd that work out?
Yeah, it didn't. So it is recording now as you're joining.
Marion, is Elena your daughter perchance?
She is. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi,
Hello,
Steve.
everybody.
I think she's coming. I think she's going to be on this tonight. I'm not sure.
Oh.
Yeah, I saw her name last week. Was on for a while anyway.
Mhm. Yeah, she took part in last week's because she talked to me about
Okay.
it.
Inga and Chester, welcome. Good to see you.
Thanks.
Hi, Inga and Chester.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, it's nice to be seen. Thanks.
Mhm.
And Steve and Beth.
Hello.
Greetings.
Good to see you.
Thanks. Mary Beth and Paul. I'll ignore Ken for now.
Oh, it still is
Yeah.
Tristan. I don't know why.
Don't need to come. Well, you can-
And Vernon. Greetings. Hi, Janet. And Janet and Floyd.
Been a minute here.
Dan and Mary, you're back. Great to see you.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, Paul, you're the same. Paul, I think I lived in DC with your son for a while. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
He's living in Oslo, Norway right now.
Really? Okay. What's he doing these days?
He's working for Doctors Without Borders.
Okay, great.
And his wife is teaching at one of the universities there.
Okay.
So that's their life right now.
Yeah. And do you all still live out near Folks Run or beyond there?
In Bergton.
Bergton, okay.
We were just out there biking yesterday.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I
About
think I may
Craters.
have passed you.
Oh, is it?
We passed a couple people biking when we were coming back from our church service at the rec center.
Okay. Well, I mean, it was maybe about 4 in the afternoon.
Oh, this was earlier.
Yeah. Okay.
Paul, is it true you had a conversation with my grandson a couple weeks ago?
I did. He was riding his bicycle or motorbike up our lane, and we got to talking, and he said you were coming out last week, and I was going to call you and have you stop by, but then some other things happened.
Yeah.
If you come up again, let me know.
Yeah, I'll have to try. I'll have to try that. It's such long ways up there, though. You know.
Yeah. So that's why it's important to let me know. So in case you get lost, or the fact that you don't do it very often, and sometime you're here, you should stop in.
Well, looks like it's time to begin, and it's great to have all of you on the call from the four corners of the state and beyond. I see Elena's joining us as well. Welcome, Elena. At least her name's there on the screen. I think Abe will be joining us too. He had some family things that came up, but I expect he'll be joining in here with us soon. Let's have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to hand it over to Les, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to share with us this evening. He's been at this kind of work, this ministry of fundraising for how many years is it, Les?
Long time,
Yeah.
since 1978.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
So lots
So
of
what is that?
experience.
42 years or something
42.
like that.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Well, yep.
I do the same thing year after year after year. Just keep begging.
Yeah, but he's learned quite a few things along the way, and I'm excited too. He's going to frame it biblically for us. He said, you know, Paul was one of the best fundraisers around. So we're going to learn from the example of the Apostle Paul, and I'm sure Les will have his own stories to share as well. Let's have a word of prayer. Gracious God, we pause and we want to give you thanks again for who you are. We thank you that every good and perfect gift comes from you, and that we can trust you to provide all our needs. Lord, we thank you that you sent your Son so that we might be in a relationship with you, and that we have the privilege of serving you and sharing the good news around the world. Bless this time, Lord, as we learn together. And you pray that you would bless Les and his thoughts as he shares with us, Lord. May we hear from you. May we grow and learn in this work. And would you renew us in joy as well, I pray, because we know that you love a cheerful giver, and we want to be cheerful givers ourselves and invite people to give out of a place of joy and gratitude and abundance. So we commit this time to you, and we invite your presence in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So the rest of you, if you want to mute your mic while we're listening. And Les, would you like people to put questions in the chat box, or are you going to stop along the way and invite some questions?
Actually, let's do it both ways.
Okay.
That way, if somebody thinks of a question and they don't have a quick enough finger to put the mic on to get the question in, we can come back to it.
Great.
And I'll keep the chat room visible so I can sort of see what's going on as people respond. And I may do a screen share on a couple things along the way as well, just because it's easier for me to refer to my notes by sharing screens than it is by trying to describe everything in detail.
Sure,
But,
sure. Sounds good. All right, well, I'll hand it over to you.
What I'd like to do, thank you. I'm honored, quite frankly, to be invited to share my experience in fundraising with a bunch of professional mission workers, professional and volunteer beggars, if you will. I'm a fellow beggar along the way. I consider myself in this role as an intermediary in many respects. When I think about the fundraising that I've done for organizations, and honestly, I don't have that many organizational experiences. Eastern Mennonite College back in the day, I worked for a couple of years with the Spokane Symphony in Spokane, Washington as their first development officer for about 2 years. And then I spent 22 years at Eastern Mennonite High School, where I ran into Inga Mast and Steve Horst, and let me see, who else do I see? Oh, Mary Beth. And I think that's it. So they know just about as much about fundraising because of the Christmas Fund Drive and the things that I tried to teach students in those days. So those principles all apply, but quite honestly, I've learned a few things since then too. So I want to frame tonight and pick up where Steve and Sarah left off last week in relation to some of their notes on the theology of fundraising and theological principles, and then Sarah's notes pretty practical in terms of some things to work at. So I'm going to go to 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and I'm not a very good preacher, I'll just say that up front, but when I think about 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and I'm just going to summarize in brief because we've only got about 60 minutes of time to work with here. So this will be like a devotional in some respects. Paul, in his appeal to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians 8, establishes some fairly basic guidelines for effective stewardship, ministry, and fundraising practice. So if you'll bear with me on those two definitions, stewardship is the business of taking care of the people that support your ministry, and fundraising is the practice of inviting people to your ministry, inviting people to invest in the work that you do day in and day out. So the combination of those two things. So Paul is very careful in 2 Corinthians to create his appeal in the context of the Corinthians' desire to support the church in Jerusalem. So you got to go back to 1 Corinthians 16, 1-4, where the Corinthian church expresses their desire to support. So this is really, in some respects, the first principle of fundraising is look for people who have a desire to help you. And where you will find most of those people is very close to your friendship network. They will be the ones who will most likely be willing to support you. It's not casting a wide net. And I've used that practice through all of my fundraising experience. Most of the organizations that I've worked with have built their network of friends from the inside out instead of buying lists and going to the public square to invite people in, but rather building from the inside out. And that's what Paul does in this passage. So he begins his appeal with a compelling story about another church that gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Now I'm quoting 2 Corinthians, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. Furthermore, they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with God's will. That's chapter 8, verses 3-5. And then Paul tells the Corinthians that the Macedonian church gave beyond their means and above expectations, and he creates a foundation for generous giving based on the value of the relationships and a willingness to sacrifice. So sometimes we hear you got to make people feel just a little bit guilty for giving. And honestly, that's what Paul does here. He makes them feel just a little bit, just a teeny bit guilty for not finishing the work. So Paul's first principle in verse 11 then is complete the work you start. Paul encourages the Corinthian church to follow through on a gift they intended to give according to your means, for if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what he does not have. So he encourages the Corinthians to give as they are able. And he's looking for that spark, as you'll find later. Aaron already sort of gave the hint. God loves a cheerful giver. 2 Corinthians 9 is where is the context of God loves a cheerful giver context. So we'll get to that. I don't want to get too far ahead. The second principle, verses 13 and 14, that Paul identifies is maintaining the balance between the giver and the receiver. So Paul dispels any idea that one group should benefit at the expense of another. Giving is a balance, equalizing act of mutual sharing. For example, he says, at the present time, your plenty will supply what you need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need. Then there's equality. So you see, there's opportunity for us to give as we are able, and when we have more than we need, we can help those who are in need, and at some point down the road, you will be the one in need, so be gracious enough to receive that. The next principle outlined is in 16 verses 16, chapter 8-24, creating an accountability and collecting money. So Paul puts this in place. He establishes the accountability system to avoid any potential criticism. And he says to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of men, beginning with Titus, who wants to go to Corinth on his own, and 2 assistants. Paul establishes a plan based on the integrity and trust to carry this gift from Corinth to Jerusalem. So Paul sends 2 people to collect the money so that there's no chance at all for any kind of inappropriate behavior. Then is one of my favorite parts of this passage. After Paul establishes the accountability, the trust, and the rapport with the believers, he isn't afraid to ask for the gift. So here we go. Verses 8:24 through chapter 9, verse 5, and verse 24 says, therefore, Show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it. So there he is, asking boldly for their gift to finish the work that they had said they wanted to do back in 1 Corinthians 16. And then he says in in chapter 9, 6 through 10, give as you have decided in your heart. Paul is careful not to put apostolic pressure on the Corinthian church to make the gift, but he intends that they prayerfully consider their response to God's call on behalf of the believers in Jerusalem. Each one should give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. You notice the context here? Each one should give as he has decided in his heart, not because you or your fundraising team or your support team or anybody else puts pressure on someone, but you simply ask in faith and in trust that they will do whatever God leads them to do, for God loves a cheerful giver. God is able, and then he goes on in verse 8 to say, God is able to make all grace abound. Notice the alls. All grace abound in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. An incredible promise. And it's these kinds of things that continue to motivate and encourage me in the work that I do day in and day out. Now, is this just for us? No, it's not. So he finishes this passage by saying in verses 11 through 15, giving produces a threefold blessing. The result of your giving, he says, produces thanksgiving to God from the recipients and beneficiaries of their giving. In addition, you, the giver, are enriched in every way, so you can be generous in every occasion. Finally, your giving supplies the needs of God's people, and God receives the honor and thanksgiving, and you receive the blessing for having given. So therein is, quite frankly, the largest motivation for me ongoing, day in and day out, why I do what I do. And when I discovered this passage, probably 35 years ago now, it inspired me to think in terms of, how do I find the joyful givers? How do I find people who are predisposed in some respects toward giving, or are predisposed toward the organizations that I am working for, and maybe even predisposed to giving beyond what I'm looking for, but rather in the context of my conversations and relationships with them, I discover places that they might consider giving, even though I don't work for the organization, which, considering 4 out of the 5 organizations that I've worked for, 3 out of the 4, 3 out of the 4 organizations that I've worked for have all been Mennonite organizations, right? So I don't just raise money for Virginia Mennonite Retirement Community or Eastern Mennonite High School, or now Eastern Mennonite School, or Eastern Mennonite University. I have always been advocating for the church in general, and it just happens that I'm working for certain organizations. So those are just some basic outlining principles that I wanted to at least get on the table. So, and I'll just add this one, and Paul hints at it, but and it was commented last week by Aaron under the partnership piece of his conversation with us, talking about making your own investment. So as either a missionary or as part of a support team, I'm going to encourage you to make your own investment in yourself or the person that you are working with before you think about asking anybody else. It makes a huge difference in terms of how you make the ask. It makes a huge difference in your own confidence and level of comfort, because I mean, and it's happened to me more times than I can ever tell you, people have said, so you don't have to tell me how much you've invested, but have you made your gift to this organization and how much do you believe in it? So I have to be able to say, honestly, I have invested. And I want my staff to do the same thing. So before you ask, before you make any kind of plans for inviting other people to join your ministry, make sure that you have made your own investment first. I might stop here just for a second to see if there are any questions. There aren't any in the chat room, but I'm just wondering if anything comes to your mind. All right. Well, I'm going to keep going. An hour isn't a very long time to summarize a lot of the things that can make us effective. What I'd like to do when I first was invited to share some things with you, I asked Aaron and the staff to identify a couple of things that might be helpful. And there have been a couple of those conversations, and probably the most recent one is acknowledging the challenges of the current environment, COVID-19, the racial and economic disparity that we find. But in light of these, what do? How do we comfortably invite people to join us in our respective ministries? Today, I got an email from one of my many blog posts that I read, and the headline was this, pretty much: acknowledge your fear and go forward. So it's a webinar that's supposed to be coming up in a week or two. But it occurs to me that probably our greatest fear is not knowing how somebody is doing when we pick up the phone, which is the most likely methodology that we're using right now to talk with people, is knowing how they are doing. How are things with you? And in light of the fact that you're probably calling or talking to people who have been supporting you, is there anybody on the call who is just getting ready to leave on a mission assignment and hasn't really done a lot of fundraising yet? Apparently not. So you've got some experience behind you already, and you have a list of people that have been supporting you. So that's good.
Yeah,
So
perhaps DJ would be, I think the
okay.
Friesens are on DJ's MST. Is that right? They may be listening. Yeah, I see them.
Yes, sorry, that is correct.
Okay.
Do you have a
Yeah.
list developed already, or are you kind of in process there?
We are we have a small list. We're still working on it.
Okay.
Encouraging him to think beyond local contexts and create, a larger list and think outside the box.
Very good. Yeah.
Thanks, Lori.
Well, and what I have told any of the boards that I've worked with, or any of the campaign committees that I've worked with over the years, is as you begin to build your list of prospects, start with the people that you know closest to you. Excuse me. Start with the people you know closest to you, and then invite those people to think, who else do I know that might have an interest in the kind of work that we're doing? I'll give you a specific example. When I came to EMHS, or to VMRC from EMHS, one of the interview questions was framed sort of like this. When we think about Les Helmuth, we think about his ability to connect to youth and young adults, and he's developed a good network of people who support EMHS. You're going to be working with seniors in the VMRC environment. How do you think you're going to do in that environment, and how will you bring donors along? And I said, well, first of all, there's an ethical question that you're asking me. And that is, can I bring the donors that I've developed at EMHS to VMRC? And Janet, you know the answer to that, right? No, you cannot do that. So what I said was this: what I will do when I get to VMRC, if I'm invited to be part of this team, is I will take a long, hard look at evaluating the donor base that you already have. And I will begin with the board of directors, and I will invite them to begin identifying people that we should cultivate and we should invite systematically to join our work, which is the same principle that you can do with your respective teams. Start with the core group of people that you have that you meet with on a regular basis, and each of you make your list of folks that you're connected to. And if you're like me, there are a lot of people, or a number of people, who I know who would, if I were sitting on a mission support team, that would probably be interested in supporting some of the work that you all are doing, but I need to be invited to do that. And if, as a member of the mission support team, you are inviting others like you to join your team, the likelihood of them joining you is significantly increased because you're the one doing the inviting. Now, the missionaries among us are also critical. Our daughter was a part of a mission outreach in Harrisonburg, and she discovered that when she spoke to people about her work, there was a better response than if somebody from her mission support team spoke about her work. And the same thing happens when I go do fundraising. When I go visit a donor and I go just by myself, it's one thing. That's one level of donor. When I take Judith along, my boss, who represents the totality of the organization in ways that I can't, that's a different level of conversation, and people listen differently. And so I encourage you to think carefully and strategically about how you approach people. So back to the question of, what about COVID-19? What about the racial tension? What about the disparity that we find in our world right now? Is now the right time to be talking to people? Yes, now's the time. Now is as good a time as it will ever be. But how do we approach them? We approach them with genuineness. We approach them with care. We approach them with maybe a question about how they are feeling and how they are dealing with the current environment. That's usually my first question when I pick up the phone and talk to a prospective donor or a resident right now. I am interested in how they are doing personally. And it's amazing how quickly you can get through the clutter if you allow them to speak a little bit about things they're uncomfortable with, things that they're concerned about, things that they wish weren't quite the way they are. And then you can begin to talk about, well, you know, let me go back one step. So to get to that point, what I typically do, and I haven't 100% made the shift yet from making a personal visit to making just a phone call visit. But what I still do is I pick up the phone or send an email and say, I'd like to have a 15 or 20-minute conversation with you. Can you give me a time when we can do that to talk about VMRC and just get an update on how you're doing? When is the best time to do that? And then we set the appointment. So that's the first step, getting the appointment. I don't assume and can't assume that as soon as I pick up the phone, they're going to drop everything and have time for me. People don't work that way. They still don't work that way. So the expectation of having 15 to 20 minutes on the phone, it's important to acknowledge this conversation is going to take maybe longer than 3 or 4 minutes. It may take 10 or 15 minutes. And so I want to honor that and give me some times that might work for you that I could call back and we could have more time. So now you're at the appointment and you have the appointed time. Take a little time to debrief on how they're doing, how their family is doing, how COVID-19 has maybe affected them, or their, give and take on some of the racial tension that's going on. Take the time then to say, thank you very much. I really appreciate the update on your life. So personally, this is how we're dealing with some things. And I just had a family stop by today and tell me how much they appreciated the personal note that I gave them at the end of a conversation about how we are doing as a family. And they said this to me: we forget that you have a family sometimes because you're always here, and we don't remember that you also have a family. So thanks for keeping us in touch like that. So those personal touches are really important. Then give a brief update of where you are in ministry. If you're in the fundraising mode right now, you're home on furlough, or you're going to be home on furlough, or you've got a team of people that are working on fundraising for you at the moment, give a brief update on what's happening in ministry. Give a brief update too on the ways that people can support you. And there are at least 3 ways that people can support you. One is obviously prayer support. And obviously the second one is going to be financial support. But the third way is they can advocate for you. Not just prayer support. Prayer is great. But if they aren't sharing the good news of what each of your teams are doing in the church or in their community or their network, then you're missing an opportunity to invite them to be part of that. I forget who it was. Oh, it was Sarah last week who said, be specific about what you ask for. Now, I've been in this business for quite a few years, and I have always been told, be careful how you ask for a specific amount. And it is true that some people are offended by the fact that you would ask them to consider a specific amount of money or a specific item. Specifically, can you pray for me? The answer is yes. Can you advocate for me, with your friends? Would you consider, and if you're talking to someone who has a demonstrated track record of giving to you, say $100 a month, would you consider, as we look into the next 3 years, would you consider increasing your support by $10 or $15 a month? Be that specific. And you will be surprised with that careful, thoughtful request. Now, the most important thing about that request, as soon as you ask the question, be quiet. Be absolutely quiet. Don't say another word until they respond. Now, you might ask, why? So what I've often found is going on in the person's mind is this: wow, either they're crazy and I don't think I'm going to do that, or they really need this so they wouldn't have asked for it, or I actually had it in mind to give them $50 more a month. And believe it or not, that's happened every now and then. Somebody says, oh no, I wasn't thinking about, and in this case, it was a $2,500 gift I asked for. And they said, no, we weren't thinking about $2,500. We were thinking about $4,500. So it does have, so be specific about what you're asking for. Now, I'm going to back up a notch. So that's the nature of the conversation. But how do you get to the place where you can confidently ask someone for support? So some of you might be familiar with the term case for support. So have you thought about, for example, why you are in ministry? Have you thought about why God has called you to do the work that you're doing? have you thought about what are the ways that God has used you? So think about your calling. Think about the impact that you are having in your work, in your ministry. Think about your own investment, how you participate, not financially, but I would encourage you to do it financially, but think about your own investment. What does that time look like for you? And use that, articulate that, meaning write it down so that for every conversation you have that as a foundation from which to give your update. You have that as a foundation to call people to additional action. So the reason for your additional request is because we are going to do this in our ministry that we have not been doing, and it's going to cost us a little more. Or the rent went up, okay? It's easy to put a budget together. Well, for some of us, it's easy to put a budget together. It's a challenge for some people, but I'm assuming with each of your ministries, you are creating a budget. So you know what your needs are, but needs are not always expressed in dollars and cents. Needs are expressed in impact in the personal lives of people. So I read a couple of your newsletters, and I absolutely enjoy the places where you have an impact on people's lives and you're able to articulate that in the newsletter. That encourages me to give more. So if you come to me and say, are you going to continue doing what you're doing? Well, yeah, I can do that. But have you thought about the fact that I could actually give more? I might, if you invited me to. I mean, those are just ways that you can, as you articulate this, your case for support, it helps not only you and your support team, but it helps the people that support you to know what difference that's making. So one of the questions that I was given to address is, why do donors give? So one of those reasons is because somebody they know invited them to give. National surveys will tell you that's typically the number 1 or 2 reason that somebody gives to some cause. A very close second, or sometimes it's first, is because they believe in the mission of what that organization or whatever you stand for. So if you are serving in a particular area of the world that somebody has a passion for, that's really helpful to know, because you might be able to attract somebody to make a gift if they know where you're serving and know what kind of impact you're having, versus, if you're going to serve on Emory Street versus serving in, see where else, Appalachia, for example. Emory Street doesn't have the same kinds of needs as Appalachia does. Although we could use a lot of help at Harrisonburg Mennonite Church, I know that, so it's on Emory Street. Its official address is High Street, but the unofficial, when it was built, it was actually Emory Street. So another question that I was invited to consider and ponder was, what about relationships? What is the importance of relationship? Maybe the best way to answer that is go back to the beginning of the way Paul addressed the Corinthian church, to remind them of the relationship that they wanted to have with the Jerusalem church. And because of Paul's relationship with the Corinthians, in chapter 16, he invited them to participate. They were the first ones to be invited to support the church in Jerusalem, and they were eager to get started, but they didn't finish their work. And so the church in Macedonia jumped on the bandwagon and outgave everybody. And Paul highlighted that and said, look what the church in Macedonia did. Okay, so the relationships. Now, let me I won't back up, I'll go forward this time. To show the importance of relationships. Some of you have been in ministry for 5, 10, 12 years. Floyd and Janet, you were in Italy for how long? 20 years? 16 years? Okay. A gentleman that I met in 1978 when I first started this work in development had worked in similar positions as what I had at EMC. And when I moved through all the different organizations that I moved through, we kept in touch. He ended up being a donor in every one of the organizations that I was working in, except for the Spokane Symphony. He didn't go out to the Spokane Symphony with me, but he was actively involved in all of the other organizations, all the other Eastern and Virginia Mennonite organizations. So we developed a really good relationship. And when I went to him the first time, because of his demonstrated support to VMRC, I invited him to consider a 6-figure gift. And I was shocked that he said no. In no uncertain terms would he give a gift to help people who couldn't help themselves and pay their own way. I was stunned, absolutely stunned. And in fact, he used language that just really caught me off guard. And I won't repeat it here, but I'll just say, when he responded, I stopped dead in my tracks and I thought for a second. And I'm convinced to this day that the Lord gave me these words to say to him. I'm really sorry you feel that way. Because in light of the fact that you have responded the way you have, it's likely you will never need the services that VMRC has, because you have built a business in such a way that you can provide for your own needs way beyond what most of us would be able to provide. And when you're ready to really talk about true philanthropic support for people like the pastors in your church, the teachers that you've had at Eastern Mennonite High School, the teachers that you've had at Eastern Mennonite University, when you are ready to talk about helping those people who have been underpaid most of their life and are living in our facilities and running out of money, call me. And I excused myself from his office. And 2 years later, this is the power of relationship, I want you to know. 2 years later, I saw him at a social function and he said, we need to talk. And he's been a faithful donor ever since then. But that kind of candor is not possible unless you look at your work in terms of the long haul. You have nothing to lose for asking for specific kinds of gifts. So the importance of relationship is so critically important. And I didn't put him down. I just said, given all the circumstances, stop and think about what you're doing. Stop and think about how you're responding. So one of the other points that I was invited to speak on is a focus on the impact of your work. Let me say it this way. The work that you are doing, I'm going to talk specifically to those who are the mission workers. This is not about you. This is not about you at all. It's about God's work. So your invitation to people is an invitation to support the work that God has called you to. And if somebody says yes, it's not a vote for you. And if they say no, it doesn't mean they don't approve of what you do. Okay? It's not about you. It's about God's work. And that's what, for me, always gives me the assurance that if somebody says no to a request that I have, it's not about me personally. In fact, when this gentleman that I just told the story about told me no, I knew that he still cared about me. Even though I confronted him, and even though he was harsh in his response to me, I knew there was still a deep care and a love for each other. And we've done several things socially since then, even though that response, I mean, it absolutely shook me. And I thought when I drove back to the office, I made the biggest mistake of my life. But I woke up the next morning. I went to bed that night, and I slept really good because I was true to what I thought I was called to do. So focus on the impact of your work. Focus on the call that you have received. Focus on the outcomes that you hope to achieve with the work that you have put in place. That will take the focus off of you as the missionary, but rather put the work on what God is doing through you, what God is doing through the ministry that you have. So we have about 18 minutes, right? I'm going to leave it this way. My final word in many respects is this. If somebody says no to you, thank them for the opportunity to share with them the ministry. Thank them for taking the time to listen. Thank them for being your friend, and move on to the next person. So I'll open it up for questions, comments.
Hi, Les. I have
Hey,
a question.
Janet.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, just realizing your depth of experience working with different organizations, but they were all Mennonites. And in some ways, the donors, as you just highlighted, the one gentleman that you just spoke to then moved on to VMRC, they are all, number of them are giving to some of the same organizations.
Right.
And I don't know if you want to just maybe speak to that a little bit, because I find that as well for MSTs, the different, where some of us are all working with about the same age group of mission workers out there.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
And they maybe have the same friends or
Yeah.
the same aunts and uncles or older people. And so do you have any advice for us how to be sensitive to people that maybe have donor fatigue, that they're just always being asked, getting newsletters from this person and this person? So I don't know, do you want to just say anything about that?
Sure. I'm happy to, because on the one hand, you used a term that I don't own.
Okay.
I don't believe in donor fatigue. I think that's it's a term that I think can be easily used as an excuse for not asking somebody.
Yes.
But I have rarely had a donor tell me they're tired of being asked for something that is meaningful to them. So that's why go back to focusing on, so the three organizations, Eastern Mennonite, the two Eastern Mennonites and Virginia Mennonite. So it's important to focus on the mission and vision of each of the respective organizations. So if I'm going to somebody that I know is a donor to Eastern Mennonite School and Eastern Mennonite University, I don't go to them saying, I know you give to them, so would you also give to VMRC? I don't do it that way. My focus is strictly on the work that VMRC is doing. And if they want to bring up the fact that they are supporting other organizations, my response to them is, good for you. Thank you for your support. It really does help the benefit. I mean, it goes to the benefit of the whole church when you do that. Would you consider a gift for at VMRC? So, and I don't remember, there are 2 or 3 Aaron, do you remember how many mission support teams I support right now? It's 2 or 3.
Yeah, I'd have to look. It's several, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. And so I don't ever get tired of hearing somebody come to me and invite me to support them, because I have a relationship with them in some way, shape, or form that inspires me to make a gift.
Mhm.
Okay, it's not just me. Sylvia is part of this picture too. So I'm not the only decision maker in the house. But when people come to us and invite us to support them, we do it because of the relationship that we have with them. So in the case of multiple mission support teams going to the same person, I'm just going to say, don't apologize for that. If the donor is not ready to support you, your mission support team, let them make that decision, but don't predetermine that they're going to say no, or go with the attitude, well, they're not going to want to support me because I know they're already supporting this team and this team and this team and the other team.
Mhm.
And I, with so many, well, for example, Wednesday coming up, June the 24th, is the Great Community Give in Harrisonburg. Okay.
Yeah.
There are, I don't know, 50, 75, I don't know how many nonprofits that are going to be on the internet highway asking people for gifts. And I'm on probably a dozen of their e-blast lists, and I'm getting them all the time. So am I going to give to all of them? No. Am I going to give to the ones that I have a really close relationship with? Yes, I am. So I'm not, I mean, there's a lot of articles out there about donor fatigue, but honestly, as a long timer in this work, the only donor fatigue, in my judgment, is coming from those of us who are asking. It's that we feel like we're in competition with everybody else. But if we are true to the mission and vision of our work, and I'm going to point to the missionaries and their support teams. If you are committed to what your mission support team is doing, don't apologize for asking for support for that mission effort, because it's critical, it's an important part of the kingdom, and it's a valuable asset to the larger church community. So don't be shy about asking for it. It's just like Paul in 2 Corinthians, he was not afraid. He put all the systems in place, and he had the right cause in place because he wanted to build a church in Jerusalem. And he followed up. So when he went to collect the offering of the Corinthian church, the 2 brothers that went ahead to help receive that money, he set them up so that they would be successful. So that's part of your job as a mission support team, is to lay the groundwork so that when your missionary comes back and does some of the asking and inviting, you set them up for success. That was a much longer answer than what you wanted, Janet. But
No, great.
No, that was a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking it, Janet.
Yeah, and mine follows kind of along with that. Is some of our workers have very small support systems and don't come from large churches, or or they haven't been around to many different places, so their support system is small. How do you enlarge your borders?
Wow, that's a really good question. And I would go back to somewhat, it's not always easy, but I'd go back to, what's the friendship network look like? And then the harder work really is to go to churches. And since churches aren't meeting right now, that's a huge challenge. And I can't even, boy, that's a really good question, Janet. It's a tough one. If you can't do the networking, maybe email, maybe again, having the mission support team go through the steps of making a list of friends that you have that might be interested. And sometimes it's a hard list, but one exercise that I did with our board for a campaign that we had, I don't know, half a dozen years ago, is I went through our donor list and I put together a list of prospects that I thought would be good for the board members to look at. And then I asked them this question: who would you like to see on this list in your friendship group that you don't see on this list? Let's start there. And we went from a list of, I think it was 260 names to over 1,000 names because they brought all those. Now, did all of those end up giving? No, they didn't. But they brought one board member opened up his phone and he wrote down 25 or 30 of his best friends. And then we sat down together, the two of us sat down together and meticulously went through each of those and evaluated them on the benefits of spending time with those donors or those prospects. Why does he think they would be leaning toward VMRC? So again, it's hard. It's the hard work of this of development, of fundraising, is doing the networking. It's almost like, with COVID-19, one of the things they want to do is figure out who you were connected to when you got positive. It's what we do as fundraisers all the time. Why not? I mean, that's what we do. We do contact tracing all the time, and it's scary because some people are afraid to tell me their friends might have an interest in what we do, but some people aren't. And so that's why we have board members. That's why we have MSTs, because we want them to be advocates for us, and that's part of the business. Good question, Janet. Hard one.
Let me add something here.
Yeah.
Especially in our time right now, but I think even in the long haul, one of the things to really look at in raising support is something that Mary and I've found that is very helpful for us during this time is contact churches that have small groups. Don't go to the larger body, but ask to be part of the small groups and visit and share in a small group setting. It's a much more personal time, and it allows people to be more personal with you, to ask questions about your ministry, and to get more involved and more interested. How this really is going to play out in the long run, I don't know. But with us right now, that's what we're focusing on, trying to get into the small groups that we have at our church, and to just share our vision there and try to build relationships with the people in that way, because then you have a more personal connection rather than just stand up in a corporate body and share about what you're doing and everybody leaves the church and nobody says hello to you.
Right. Right. That's a great plan. In fact, as churches begin to open up, the step that our church at Harrisonburg Mennonite is taking is we are not gathering yet as a corporate body, but they are encouraging us to meet in small groups, to meet in Sunday school type settings, but outside, so that we have opportunity. So there is an opportunity to get to churches in small group kinds of settings. That's a great point. Other questions?
A comment, Les. There are people, I mean, we are doing giving through support teams to individual people. I think yet in a more specific way, people are giving to specific works and that have histories to it. If you pick on Albania, they remember it of being an area that was communist that is now fallen, it is now open. And I think they love to hear stories where a vision of what they had is being fulfilled through their giving, and telling those kinds of stories as to how their contributions has helped to enlarge a vision that they have, brings to them joy. and
Yeah.
telling that kind of a story that maybe a worker has reported to them gives them a sense of, I'm glad I was a part of that. I helped to get that done, helped God to get that
Right.
done.
Right. And that's where your the mission support team newsletters can really be effective in encouraging ongoing support and ongoing giving by highlighting those stories where the vision that the missionary had when they went in, or the mission support team had when they went in, they report out periodically how that vision is being realized. Really important. So back to the case statement that I mentioned earlier, identify, what your initial calling was and how effective you are in fulfilling that calling through the work that you've been called to.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point, Les. I think we all would do well to really hone that, sound bite, not in an artificial way, a real authentic way that we believe in, but be able to articulate it clearly and succinctly to people so that when we have an opportunity, we can say it and invite them in.
Right.
We have a couple more minutes. Anyone else have a burning question or a challenge you're facing that you want to share with us and hear some of Les' reflections on?
Aaron, I was just thinking, I'm not sure if we have it or not, but maybe we need a module for our orientation on fundraising and really how to work at this in a good way. I know
see
we
a thumbs
talked
up.
about it some, but really to hone in on it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something we've developed now this year, actually. Martin worked on that, and Abe.
Okay.
And doing these sessions is part of our continuing education in that regard. But yeah, that is something we've developed. Yep,
Okay.
it's so important. Thanks.
Yeah. Very good. Well, may the Lord bless you all. May the Lord keep you. May his face shine on you and be gracious to you and give you peace as you do ministry.
Thank you so much, Les. Let's give him a virtual round of applause and a thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time and sharing with us so generously.
Happy to do it.
All of you, I just echo that blessing and pray that God will further your work. And as you have questions and challenges, feel free to reach out to Abe and myself. And if we don't have the answers, we'll do what we can to find them for you. Okay. But it gives me so much pleasure to work with you and support what you're doing. I love reading the newsletters and sharing stories about what God's doing in your work with others. And just pray God's empowerment upon you as you continue to invite people to support what God's doing. Thanks.
Amen.
And God bless to all of you.
Yeah, thanks.